Let's turn together to the book of Acts. And as you turn to Acts, please find Acts chapter 21. And we're going to pick up with verse 37, which is right where we left off last week. And I will read all the way down through verse 29 of the next chapter. So listen to the reading of God's word. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And I answered, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said to me, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, "What shall I do, Lord?" And the Lord said to me, "Rise and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that is appointed you to do." And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man, according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, "The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name." When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." And I said, "Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving, watching over the garments of those who killed him." And he said to me, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Up to this, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging, to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. This is God's word. Let's pray. Father, may you speak clearly to us this morning so we see where you are at work in our lives as you have been at work in Paul's life for the sake of the gospel. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, this morning, this lengthy text that we're going to look at has its context in the previous verses, 17 to 27, where Paul had met with the elders of the Jerusalem church, along with James, who was the lead pastor of the church there in Jerusalem. And you remember that some rumors had been spread about Paul. And because of those rumors, the Jewish Christians who were zealous for the law were angry. Look back at verse 21. It says, "They've been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children and to walk according to our customs." And so in order to disprove this rumor, James and the elders tell Paul, listen, here's what you should do. You should go to the temple, participate in a purification ceremony that will allow you into the temple along with these 4 brothers that are in the church who are under a Nazirite vow, and you should pay for their expenses to complete that vow. Now, from a human perspective, as we saw last week, it seems as if this backfired. Remember, Paul in verse 30 is seized by an angry mob, it says, who dragged him out of the temple. And in verse 31, it says they're seeking to kill him. But the Roman soldiers intervened, and they removed Paul from the crowd, and they were going to spare him from this murderous mob by taking him into the Antonia fortress, which sat right there on the northwestern corner of the temple on a precipice there. So they want to take him in there and protect him as long as they can get to the bottom of what's going on. They would rather him be in Roman custody than this angry mob send the city into turmoil, which could cause problems for the Romans themselves. So we pick up in verse 37. And it says, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, that's a commander, "May I say something to you?" And this man says, "Do you know Greek?" And then he says, "Aren't you not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Now remember, verse 26 in the next chapter tells us the name of this tribune is Claudius Lysias, and he's surprised when he hears Paul speak Greek because he assumes that Paul is this Egyptian false prophet who had recently led a revolt. Now, the first century Jewish historian Josephus writes about this Egyptian assassin. He was an insurrectionist who had prophesied that if he brought his forces to the city of Jerusalem, the walls would collapse, just like they did with Jericho, and it would leave the Romans therefore defenseless in this city. They'd be out in the open, and they'd be able to overtake them. But the problem is that it didn't go that way. These walls didn't collapse, and so the Roman governor Felix stepped in, and he squashed this. And when he did so at the time, 400 of those men died, and another 200 of them were taken captive, and the remaining men were led by this Egyptian insurrectionists out into the wilderness where they ran to hide. So now this man thinks, oh, this guy has come back, and so that's what he thinks is taking place. Paul in verse 39 says, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city, and I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." So notice Paul responds in 2 very significant ways. First, he says, "I'm a Jew," which obviously we know he's saying, I'm not this Egyptian terrorist, but it also tells us something, doesn't it, about Paul's life and his theology. He says, "I'm a Jew," which means that he never at any point after his conversion stopped seeing himself as a Jew. If Paul didn't see himself as a Jew, he would have said, "I'm not a Jew." But he says, "I am a Jew." So this is setting the stage for his defense that he's about to make in just a moment. Second thing you notice is he says that he is from Tarsus in Cilicia, which he says is a citizen of no obscure city. In fact, Tarsus was a very significant city. At this time in history, it was home to one of the most esteemed universities in the whole world. And so, along with Athens and Alexandria, Tarsus was right there at the top, in the top 3. And so this means that Paul is saying, look, I'm not some guy, I'm not this redneck that has come from the country and can't barely read or write. Apologies to rednecks among you, all right? I'm from Texas. I get carte blanche permission to call anyone a redneck, all right? But he says, I'm an educated man. I can speak Greek. And so he speaks to the crowd in Greek. And so before you look at Paul's speech, you have to remember here something that Paul has just been beaten within an inch of his life. I mean, he's in chains. His hands and his feet are chained together. He's beaten up. And you would think that most people would be happy to be taken into the fortress and protected. Not Paul. He wants to keep on talking. There's no quit in this guy. He wants to preach even though he's beaten up and bloodied and in chains. So verse 40 says, when he, meaning Lysias, had given him permission, so he might have been impressed with Paul's credentials, or maybe he just wants to hear Paul's explanation for the disturbance. He says, standing on the steps, that Paul motioned with his hand to the people. This is an action of an orator, but remember he's in chains, so he kind of gives this motion. And then there was a great hush, and he addressed them in the Hebrew language. Now, if you have the NIV Bible, it says Aramaic and not Hebrew, and that's because the word here can be used to describe Aramaic as well as Hebrew. And Aramaic, in fact, was the most widely spoken dialect amongst the Israelites in Jerusalem at the time. It's what Jesus spoke, and so it's probably more accurate that it was actually Aramaic that he spoke in. He says in verse 1, brothers and fathers. Now, I want you to notice, this is the exact same way that Stephen started his speech when they killed him. And in Acts 7:2, Stephen is making his speech before an angry mob that Paul is presiding over. So Stephen calls Paul brothers and fathers, and then turns around and Paul kills him for it. So you can see where this setting is. And so this is not only a congenial and respectful way to say, I'm one of you, but also notice that he's emphasizing here in calling them fathers that he's demonstrating respect and deference to the elders who are present there. He says, hear the defense. That word defense is the Greek word apologia. That's where we get our English word apologetics from. Hear the defense that I make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew or Aramaic language, they became even more quiet. He said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as all of you are this day. So he begins his defense by restating that he's a Jew. He says not only is he a Jew, but in fact he says, I'm a Jew with a better Jewish resume than any of you in the crowd. And so he's making his defense. He says, first, I was born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but I was brought up in this city, which means that even though he wasn't born in Jerusalem, his family was part of the dispersion of Jews who lived outside of the city. He was brought up in this city. From what early age, I don't know, but second of all, we know that he was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, who was one of the most respected and known rabbis in the entire history of Judaism. And Gamaliel is the man who had personally trained Paul. And he says that this man who had trained him in the law, which is why Paul has such a grasp of the law that he can just spit it out at any moment. You have to remember, every time Paul is quoting long texts of the Old Testament in books like Romans, you look at these long texts and you see them, you say, look at this. Paul just has this mastery of it. He didn't carry around a Bible in his pocket. And when he writes the prison epistles and he quotes scriptures, it's not like he has the Bible with him in prison. He knows these texts. Gamaliel had taught him the text. He had taught him how to interpret the text. He had taught him the application of the text. And the way he taught him to apply it is, look, in the strict manner of the law of our fathers, meaning in strict conformity to the law, which is why Paul was a Pharisee. Third, he says that he was zealous for God as all of you are this day. He acknowledges that the reason that they're attempting to kill him is not because they're bad people, as much as he's saying that you're just zealous for God. Now, they're misguided in their zeal, but Paul himself was once misguided in his zeal. They've wrongly assumed that Paul, like Stephen before him in their mind, they think that he's a blasphemer of both God and the law, of Moses, of the temple. So now Paul goes on to show the extent to which he has been even far more zealous for God than they've ever dreamed of being. He says in verse 4, I actually persecuted this way. Remember, the term this way is a technical term in Acts referring to Christians. He says, I persecuted people to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. So prior to his conversion, Paul was so zealous for God, according to the strict manner of the law that he was trained in, that he violently persecuted Christians, even putting them to death. He was so ruthless that Luke makes it a point of recording that Paul made it a point of stating that he even killed women, which was simply unthinkable. Then in verse 5 he says that even the high priest, the man who's in charge of everything, the whole council itself, all of the highest people in Israel can testify to the truthfulness of what Paul is saying. So it's like Paul's just making this up. The highest authorities in Israel have to confirm what Paul is saying. In fact, those are the people who gave him the authority to go off to other places and kill Christians and bring them back to prison. He was so zealous for God according to the strict manner of the law that he hunted down everybody who was faithful to the way, no matter where they hid. Now, most of these people in that angry mob had never, ever, ever gone off and done what he had done. And so he has the right to speak with authority about being zealous for God in a way they can't even speak to. Paul's resume then speaks for itself, doesn't he? There's nobody in the entire crowd that can claim what Paul claims. So if Paul then were going to change his mind about the way and who Jesus was, then the only way it could happen would have to be through a divine intervention from this God who he was so zealous for. Paul would never change his mind on his own. And so that's an impossibility. And this is exactly what Paul says took place. He now recounts his conversion story. And this conversion story is so important that Luke records it 3 times in the book of Acts. Earlier in Acts 9, we read it from Luke's narrator perspective as he tells the story. Then now Paul describes it again in Acts chapter 22, and he'll later tell the story again in Acts chapter 26. The 22 and 26 tellings of it come from Paul's firsthand account as he tells the story as it unfolded before him as real events happening to him. So when you see a couple of things that sound a little different in the 2 tellings between Acts 22 and Acts 9, it's because Acts 9 is a narrator telling it. Acts 22 is Paul telling it as it unfolded for him. Verse 31. Having received letters from the high priest of the whole council, he says in verse 5, I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there. So he's going to go get these Christians and he's going to take them out of Damascus. He's going to bring them in bonds to Jerusalem and be punished. Verse 6, as I was on my way and I drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone all around me. He was engulfed in this light. Now, Luke didn't record in Acts chapter 9 the time of day, but Paul tells us when it happened. He says, this happened about noon. Paul knows because he was there at noon when it took place, and we are now Paul is emphasizing, he's stressing how bright the sun would have been at that point of the day. This wasn't early in the morning when the sun hadn't come up over the horizon, nor was it late in the evening when it had gone below the horizon. This was at the brightest part of the day, and the sun outshone the brightest part of the day, sunlight covering the earth at this point. This is like when you turn on a light bulb outdoors. It makes no difference at all. The same could be said about the sun. It had been reduced to nothing more than an artificial light because the brightness of Jesus himself overshadowed everything. This is not a natural light. It didn't come from the material world. It was a supernatural event in which heaven invaded earth right here in this moment, and the glory that emanated from the risen Lord Jesus was overpowering of the sun itself. The light from heaven blinds Paul. Verse 7 says, I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, which was his name before he began traveling in Gentile territory and used his Greek name Paul. He said, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now you have to imagine how devastating these words must have been for Paul to actually hear. These words blew up his entire worldview at this time. The whole time, Paul had been going around persecuting Christians because of Paul's zeal for God. Because that means Paul thought he was on the right side of God. He thought, I'm on God's side. I'm defending God's honor by punishing all these people who are blaspheming God's name. So Paul thinks he's doing the right thing. Suddenly he discovers that all this time he was the one who was acting opposed to God. It wasn't these people he was persecuting who were against God and his purposes and his will. It was Paul himself who was against God and his purposes and his will because he had been blaspheming the name of Jesus. Paul could not have been more wrong in all that he had done in persecuting these Christians. Jesus was the Messiah, he discovers. That means the gospel is true, and by persecuting the church, Paul had been not defending Israel, but actually persecuting the true Israel of God, and he had made himself an enemy of both God and his Messiah, which, as you know from the Psalms, those who are the enemies of the Messiah don't last long. And so here Paul has been opposed to him. Let me point out once again how remarkable it is, as I told you when we looked at Acts chapter 9, that Jesus says here, "Why are you persecuting me?" Remember, where's Jesus? He's at the right hand of God. He's in heaven. He's far beyond the reach of this man, Paul. And yet, this statement is remarkable in its theological significance because it means as Paul persecutes the church, he is persecuting Jesus because the church and Jesus are united by faith. Or the church is united to Christ by faith, I should say, which means that the church and Jesus are to be considered one and the same. What you do to the church, you are in essence doing to Christ, which means that Paul, in persecuting Christ, has been persecuting, or in persecuting the church, has been persecuting Christ. That's a bad place to be. So now in verse 9 he says, "Now those who were with me saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me." So now you see that these people who've been traveling with Paul gives us some more information. He says, look, they saw the light and they actually heard the voice. So they had an experiential encounter alongside of Paul with something that was supernatural. However, they didn't understand what the voice was actually saying. So they heard some sort of sound taking place, but they didn't understand it. Now this is important because this means that Paul wasn't hallucinating. So for anybody that thinks, well, Paul just had some sort of vision and was hallucinating, and this didn't really happen. No, this actually really happened in real space and real time because others were there. They didn't think about this from the standpoint of, oh, we somehow read Paul's mind and saw that in his mind he heard a voice, but rather they heard a voice. They saw the light, so it really took place. Verse 10, "What shall I do, Lord? The Lord said to me, rise and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that is appointed for you to do." Now that word appointed means assigned. So what's happening here is the Lord is saying, listen, there's an assignment that I have for you. I have assigned you a task. And when you get to Damascus, you're going to find out what this task actually is. And so since verse 11 says, I could not see because of the brightness of the light, in other words, Jesus had blinded Paul. Let's be very clear about that. Jesus blinded Paul because he had a task for Paul and he wanted to humble Paul. Never, ever, ever assume that things that happen in your life that are not what you would desire physically to happen to you are always opposed to what God wants for your life. Jesus wanted Paul to be blind, and he was. And so he is led by the hand because he can't see. He goes into Damascus. Verse 12 says, "And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and I saw him." Now remember the context in which Paul is telling this story. He is defending himself before a hostile crowd of zealous Jews who have been trying to murder him. And so his description of Ananias then is a very important description in terms of Paul's defense to this crowd. Because look, Even though Ananias was a Jewish Christian, meaning like Paul, he was a Jew who had placed his faith in Jesus as Messiah, he was still known by the Jews who lived in Damascus as being a devout man according to the law. Now, isn't this what they've said about Paul? They've said Paul is against the law. Paul is not devout, he's a blasphemer. And yet he says this man was well thought of. So Paul's defending himself against these Jews who see his devotion to Jesus as being at odds with his Jewish heritage, which means that he cannot be a faithful Jew and be faithful to Christ in their mind. And yet, here's another bit of evidence that devotion to Jesus doesn't make someone an unfaithful Jew, because all of the Jews who lived in Damascus looked at this man Ananias and they said, we know he is devoted to the law, we know he's devoted to Jesus, and we still respect his reputation. So then the next thing that Paul says is not only was this man well thought of by the brothers, but look, a great miracle took place. It was through this man that I received my sight, which means that God had validated the faithfulness of Ananias through the miracle of Paul receiving his sight by his hands, which is what we've seen time and time again in the book of Acts. The miracle does nothing more than point to the testimony of Christ as Messiah. And so now then you see this connection between Jesus as being the Messiah and Israel's God in what Paul says next, verse 14. He said, the God of our fathers, now I want you to underline that, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, which was, look, to see the righteous one. Now underline that phrase, the righteous one. The God of our fathers and the righteous one. Connect the dots here. And to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. Now the phrase, the God of our fathers, comes from the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 15, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, he says this to him. Say to this people, Moses, say to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Who's the fathers of Israel? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the patriarchs. The God of your fathers has sent me to you. So Moses is sent to bring a message of deliverance to God's people from the God of our fathers. Likewise, Paul is being sent to the Gentiles to bring a deliverance to God's people from who? The God of our fathers. So Ananias tells Paul, look, it's the God of our fathers who has appointed you to know his will. So whatever is taking place with Paul comes from Israel's God. And what is his will? First, notice right here, it's that Paul, look, is to see the righteous one and to hear a voice from his mouth. Now the phrase righteous one was a messianic title in the Old Testament, which means then that it was the will of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that Paul would see the Messiah, and it was the will of Israel's God that Paul would hear a voice from heaven from which the Messiah would do what? He would reveal his identity, and who does he say he is? He says, I am Jesus of Nazareth. So Israel's God gives Paul a vision in which he sees the righteous one, and the righteous one says that his name is Jesus of Nazareth. This is the reason Paul is converted to Christ. That reason right there. Paul's conversion was not in defiance of Israel's God. It was because of Israel's God. That's what he's telling the crowd. And now Ananias tells Paul the second part of God's will for him in verse 15. He says, you will be a witness for him, for Christ, to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And that echoes the words of Acts chapter 1, verse 8, when Jesus says to the apostles, you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. So the reason that Paul has traveled the entire world preaching that the crucified Jesus is the resurrected and ascended and exalted Jesus, who is now therefore the Lord of both heaven and earth, is because that's what the God of our fathers told him to do. That's what the God of Moses had assigned him to do. So he was not against Israel's God at all. In fact, he was acting on his behalf. Verse 16. And now, why do you wait? Ananias says to Paul, rise, be baptized, wash away your sins, call on his name. And according to Acts chapter 9, Paul does that immediately. Immediately he's baptized in an act of complete submission to the lordship of the very Jesus whom 3 days before he hated and wanted to eradicate all of his followers. The only explanation for Paul's instantaneous conversion was that he had seen the resurrected Jesus. He saw him and he understood that Jesus, the one who had been crucified, was actually the righteous one, and that Jesus, the righteous one, had been exalted by the God of our fathers. This is what Paul understands. And so after his conversion in Acts chapter 9, what does Paul do? Well, he immediately begins preaching in the synagogues of Damascus, and then after that, he goes away into Arabia for 3 years. We looked at this at some length before. Then after this 3-year period, then he comes back to Jerusalem, now 3 years after his conversion, for the first time since he's been converted. And when he returns, we're told in Acts chapter 9, verse 28, this: So Paul went in and out among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of the Lord, and he spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, but they were seeking to kill him. The Hellenists were who? The same Jews that wanted Stephen killed. They disputed with Stephen, and Paul approved of that. And now Paul's in trouble. They want to kill Paul just like they killed Stephen. But guess what? It's not the will of the Lord for Paul to die. And if it's not the will of the Lord for Paul to die, then Paul won't die. This is the reason Christians are not to live in fear over their lives. You do not live in fear over your lives because you die when it is the Lord's will for you to die. You do not die when it is not His will for you to die. That's the way it goes, bottom line. Doesn't mean you run out into traffic and just dance up and down, but it means that you understand that you are the one who takes risks for Christ. Christ doesn't take risk because risk implies ignorance. Christ is not ignorant of the future. You are, and so you take risks, but you take a secured risk. Secured in the sense that you know that Christ commands your future and your destiny. And so here's Paul, verse 17. He says, when I had returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple, and I fell into a trance. And I saw him, the exalted Jesus, say to me, make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly. Remember, this is years ago. This is after he'd been converted for 3 years, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by approving and watching over their garments of those who killed him. So Jesus says to Paul, look, you need to get out of town. You're in trouble. They're going to kill you. And Paul says, well, wait a minute. You know, the drastic nature of my conversion probably makes me a great asset. And so I probably should stay here. That's the logical thing to do. And Jesus says, no, you don't need to stay here. Isn't it funny? Paul thought that if he stayed in Jerusalem, that his story and his testimony would be so powerful that God could use him. And that if he were gone, there'd be nobody like him. And God says, no, I'm not interested in your opinion, Paul. I want you to go. And Paul thinks, but if I stayed, lots of people could get saved. Now Paul's come back. They still hate him. But what have we been told earlier in this last week? Thousands had come to Christ in Jerusalem. See, he didn't need Paul. He could save people however he wanted through whichever people in the Jerusalem church he wanted to use. Never make the mistake of thinking that you're God's gift to the world. And so they want to kill him. And so look what happens in verse 21. He said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. It wasn't his plan for him to stay. Now remember, Paul is recounting these events here in Acts 22 as his defense before a hostile crowd of zealous Jews who hate him and who want to kill him. When Paul says in verse 21, the Lord said to him, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. At this moment, the hostile crowd loses its mind. Up until now, they've listened to everything he's said. And he tells them he's been sent to the Gentiles, and they lose their mind. Verse 22 says, up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, away with him. Get rid of him. This is the same thing they said last week. Away with such a fellow from the earth. In other words, kill this guy. For he should not even be allowed to live. The one thing this crowd cannot tolerate is the idea that the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the righteous one, the Messiah, would actually send someone to pronounce God's blessing to the Gentiles. These are the blessings of Israel. For Paul to suggest that the Gentiles were now God's people was so horrifying to this crowd that they said, this guy shouldn't even be allowed to live. Verse 23, as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks in order to stone him, just as the angry crowd had taken off their cloaks and laid them at the feet of Paul, as he said in verse 20. Now they want to do the same thing. They're flinging dust into the air, an expression of horror and indignation. But once again, in God's providence, he intervenes through the tribune. The tribune ordered him, verse 24, to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. So Paul's lengthy defense here is in no way helping the tribune. The tribune probably doesn't even understand this dispute and all the things that Paul is saying. So he decides, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to take him in and I'm going to torture him and interrogate him. And we'll get to the bottom of this. Now, flogging was a horrific form of torture. You took a flagellum, which was a short club that had strips of leather attached to it with pieces of bone and metal intertwined into the leather strips. And when they would strike the back of someone, those pieces of bone and metal would attach to the flesh, and when they would pull back on the club, it would tear chunks of flesh right off of their body. Now remember that throughout Paul's travels, he has been beaten before with rods. He has been stoned within an inch of his life. He's been imprisoned. But he's never, up until now, suffered a Roman flogging. This would be worse than anything that Paul has ever experienced. And if you didn't give up the information quickly, which most people would do in this form of torture, you died. And the reason you would die is because you would lose so much blood. And if you didn't lose enough blood, then it was probably due to the fact that they were preparing you for crucifixion as they did with Jesus himself. Verse 25, when they had stretched him out for the whips. You notice what they're doing? They're pulling his skin tight, aren't they? So that when those pieces of metal and bone hit his flesh on tight skin, it's going to make it even worse. It's going to increase the severity of the blows. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, hey, is it lawful for you to flog a man who's a Roman citizen and uncondemned? Now the turn of the story. Just as he's about to be flogged, he reveals to the centurion that he's a Roman citizen. Now this presents multiple problems here. First, Roman citizens were not allowed to be flogged. So they could torture, they could do other things to Roman citizens, but flogging was so bad that along with crucifixion, you didn't flog Roman citizens. So Paul tells them this. And second, Roman citizens were not allowed to be punished apart from a legal Roman trial, which Paul has not received. So the thing you have to understand is that if you were in charge and you punished a Roman citizen without a fair trial, then you, as the one in charge, were sentenced to death. So now what's happened is that this man, this Claudius Lysias, this tribune and his centurion are about to commit a crime that is going to be met with capital punishment. So you can see where Paul has turned the tables. The reason Paul's claim is taken seriously, well, what if anybody could just lie? They could just say, I'm a Roman citizen. But guess what? If in your trial you lied about your Roman citizenship, then it brought with it an automatic death penalty. So not very many people lied about this. So now there's a problem. To put it lightly, this is a big deal that he's a Roman citizen. Verse 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and he said to him, what are you about to do? Hey, this man is a Roman citizen. So the tribune came to him and said, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And Paul answers, yes. And the tribune answered and said, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. Paul says, but I'm a citizen by birth. Now, technically speaking, you could not purchase Roman citizenship. But during the reign of Emperor Claudius, there were bribes taking place in which, and I know it's impossible to believe that our elected officials at any time in history would ever take bribes and for payment give people privileges. That doesn't sound like something that would happen. But these people were taking bribes during that period, and they were selling citizenship. Now, this man's birth name is Lysias, but now his name is Claudius Lysias, which means that he purchased his citizenship under the reign of Emperor Claudius, and in order to honor that, he took on the name Claudius as a form of honor. And so this is what's happened. Paul has not bribed anyone. And Paul tells the tribune, he says, I'm a citizen by birth, which means that even though Lysias is a Roman tribune and commander, which puts him, in a sense, higher up the ladder when it comes to the chain of command here, because he's a Roman appointed official. The problem is that because Paul is a citizen by birth, Paul actually, in the stratification system of the Roman Empire, has a higher status than him. You might think of it in terms of back in the day when you had the thought of those who possessed old money versus new money in the social circles of the Gilded Age. Well, this is where Paul is. Paul says, I'm actually a citizen by birth. And so now then, the problem is that he can't break the law by flogging a Roman citizen without a trial, and he especially can't beat someone who's a higher status than him. So God has worked here in the details. Verse 29, so those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So had Paul not been a Roman citizen, what would have happened? Well, he'd have flogged him. And if he was alive at the end of that, once he discovered what it was all about, he'd have just turned him back over to the Jews. And what would the Jews have done? Well, the Jews would have killed him. They would have finished off whatever was left after the flogging. However, in the providence of God, once again, Paul's life is spared, and his life is spared, and it sets in motion a series of events that will transpire over the remainder of the book of Acts, ultimately leading Paul to Rome, where he will stand in front of the Roman emperor himself, where he will give testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. Lord willing, that's where we'll pick up the story and see how things unfold for Paul as we continue with this next week. But in closing, I really want you to reflect on two truths in this narrative. Now, let me just state them simply. First thing I want you to consider is that Paul's Roman citizenship was the result of his birth, which means that he had absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever. You know, if I asked you, how much did you contribute to your birth? You would say none. I say, how much did you contribute to your conception? You'd say none. In fact, you'd hate the thought. If I said, how much did you contribute to the day you were born? They'd say nothing. You were birthed by someone else. That's what birth means. They do the work. Now, likewise, Paul's kingdom citizenship was the result of his new birth, and he contributed how much to that? Well, he contributed nothing to that. God sovereignly brought Paul into the world as a Roman citizen. He was born as a Roman citizen, and he had nothing to do with any of that. Paul didn't get to pick to be a Roman citizen, no more than he could have picked to have not been a Roman citizen. It was God's doing, and the reason was so that one day God could sovereignly save Paul, giving him regeneration and new birth into the kingdom, so that with this Roman citizenship, he might be his apostle to the Gentiles to the very ends of the earth. In other words, we could say it this way: God saved Paul as a Roman citizen for his purposes, in order that Paul would be an apostle to the Gentiles to the very end of the earth. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever stopped in your life to really give any consideration as to why you were born where you were born? You ever thought about that? I mean, why were you born here? For those of you that are American citizens and you were born in America and your citizenship is American by birth, why is that? I mean, you didn't do that. Don't have this idea that the preconceived you was some sort of disembodied, floating around, It's a Wonderful Life Clarence, talking, and you just said, of all the places I've been looking at the earth, and I've decided the best place for me to be born would be America. So I'd like to go there. As if everyone else somehow picked the wrong place. No, you didn't strike the lottery in life either when you were born in America. You were born in America, and you were born here because God sovereignly ordained that's where you would be born. Likewise, if you're a person here who is not born in America, wherever you were born there for whatever purposes God had in choosing that's where you would be born. Your life exists physically in the boundaries it has existed in, both geographically and in time, because it's what God wanted. God wanted you to be born during the time you were born. So if you're alive in 2023, it's because that's when God wanted you to be alive. You ever stop to think about why you were educated wherever you were educated? You ever look back and say, why did my parents send me to this school? Why did my parents not care if I went to school? You ever look and ask yourself, why did my parents stay married? Why did my parents get divorced? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? You ever look back? See, we're really big in American popular psychology on these concepts of making peace with our past and dealing with all those things. And here's the thing I would tell you, as a Christian, you don't necessarily need to make peace with your past as much as you need to make peace with God and recognize that your past is part of His purpose for your life. And if you think that way, then you'll start to say, why is my life resume the way it is? Why do I have the experiences I have? Why have I been to the places I've been? What you'll come to quickly realize if you take any time seated humbly before the Lord doing this is you'll say, I think it's true that God sovereignly brought me into the world when He did, where He did, for purposes that are beyond anything that I can imagine. And so I exist in human history because this is when God wanted me to exist. And you say, then why did God save me? Well, God saved me because of His sovereign purposes to use my life resume for His purposes. And so everything that He's done is for His purpose in the world. And so when you look at your life, you have to ask yourself, if God brought Paul into the world as a Roman citizen and then brought him into the kingdom as a Roman citizen for the purpose of being His apostle to the Gentiles, then why did God bring me into the world, perhaps as an American citizen, and then bring me into the kingdom as a kingdom citizen so that I could be blank? What's your blank? What is your blank? You did not get saved just to go to heaven. If that were the case, you would have been saved and you would have died on the spot. You were saved by God, not with a clean slate and no back. You were saved by God with all your background. If He wanted all your background to disappear, He would have erased it all. You'd have come to faith in Christ, and it would have been like getting divine amnesia. You'd have forgot everything. If you ask yourself, why can't I just let go of these past memories and failures and mistakes? If God wanted you to no longer remember your past failures and mistakes, He would have erased them from your brain. He's capable of doing it. But He didn't. Why did He leave them there? What is His purpose for you? How does He intend to use you? You never know. You think Paul, throughout his life, ever thought as a Jew, I wonder when this Roman citizenship is going to come in handy? Isn't it fascinating how quickly it came in handy when his back was being stretched out, the skin on his back was being stretched out? Paul had a whole past, and he used it for the Lord. Imagine now for just a moment what the world would be like today, in your life in particular, what it would be like today if Paul had used his impressive resume to serve only himself and had never come to Christ. What would your life be like if there were no Romans, if there were no 1st and 2nd Corinthians? What would your life be like without Galatians and Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians? What would it be like without 1st and 2nd Thessalonians or 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus? What if there were no Philemon? What would you do if that didn't exist? It wouldn't exist if Paul would have said, I'm a Roman citizen. I hit the jackpot on life. I can abandon my Judaism. I can abandon everything. I can be wealthy. I can be privileged. I have a great education. I came from one of the leading cities in the world. And yet that's not what he does, is it? God saves Paul, and Paul takes everything he is and he uses it for everything he's worth. How are you being used by God? How are you looking at your past and stopping dead in its tracks your endless cycle of letting your past determine everything about your life, and instead letting Jesus determine everything about your life and letting your past only serve to aid in the cause of Christ? See, our lives belong to the Lord. And if you are in Christ, understand that it was His sovereign will to save you. You were no more worthy of His kingdom than any of these people who ever gets saved in the Bible. But He saved you. It was His sovereign will that Christ would die for your sins. It was His sovereign will to raise Christ from the dead and exalt Him to His right hand to rule over the nations, making Him Lord of heaven and earth. It was His sovereign will to give the Holy Spirit to His people. It was the sovereign will of God that salvation would be by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And if you have been saved, it is by His grace alone, for His glory alone. Therefore, how are you being used by Him for His glory alone? Don't ever make the mistake of assuming that your life is a series of random chance events that have happened. One event stacked upon another up until the moment you're saved, and then from every subsequent moment after you're saved is by God's sovereign will to bring about His purposes in all of the earth. He can use you no matter where you've come from, no matter who you are. And so surrender your life willingly to the Lord. Entrust yourself to Him. Face the world head on. Don't be afraid. Be courageous. Know that God has made you who you are for His purposes. And His purposes are clear. It is to glorify His Son, Jesus. Let's pray together. Father, thank You for saving us by grace alone, through faith alone, for Your glory alone. I pray that You would use each one of us in Christ for great things in this world. And I pray You would do that by first redefining great for us. We hear being used for great things, and we think of things that the world would think of as great, things that would be written about in history books. Oftentimes, Lord, great things are nothing more than that we simply sat down beside our child and we told them in childish language the mysteries of Christ and the gospel. Sometimes it means we were just faithful in our job every day to be salt and light in the world. Sometimes, Lord, it means that You might call us to open Bibles and talk to others in living rooms, at kitchen tables. Sometimes it means from pulpits. Sometimes it means in prisons. Wherever it is, whatever the circumstances, we're never there by chance. We're there by You. It's just for Your purposes and Your glory, which if I start thinking about it, Lord, and let my mind run to all the places that You've taken me, Lord, it's beyond my comprehension to understand Your faithfulness. And when I think about that in the lives of so many people sitting here whose stories I've heard, I can't help but be overcome with emotion. You are faithful and You are good. Thank You for Your word, which continually guides us to truth. And we pray all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen.